Surrender the control. A guided sleep meditation. A sharp, vibrating current of panic is running through your chest right now because you are looking at an empty space in your calendar, an unresolved decision, or a project that has no clear ending in sight. You are lying in the dark, but your mind is working like a frantic architect, sorting through schedules, replaying lists, and trying to force the upcoming weeks into a state of perfect, predictable control. There is a deep systemic dread inside your body that equates an inactive hour with absolute failure, whispering that if you do not continuously push, organize, or manage the details of your existence, everything around you will collapse into chaos. Your nervous system feels stretched to its absolute limit, exhausted by the relentless habit of micromanaging your life, yet utterly terrified of what might happen if you simply stop doing. Let the specific atmosphere of this late hour absorb your frantic momentum. The air carries a cool, mineral crispness, thick with the faint, brackish scent of a low tide and dry sea salt, a sensory reminder of a vast coastline where elements resolve themselves without any human intervention. The surface beneath you is completely flat, wide, and unmoving, offering an expanse of absolute stability that requires no balance or effort from your side. The small, tense muscles around your temples, the ones that tighten whenever you try to force a solution out of an empty room, can finally surrender their grip to the dark. Right now, nothing is required of you. The administrative machinery of your day has ground to a halt. The horizon is clear, and you are safe enough to soften. You are not broken because you cannot easily tolerate an unstructured hour. What you are experiencing tonight is not a personal failure. It is merely the conditioned reflex of a mind that has been taught that its worth is entirely dependent on its visible labor. Tonight, we will not force the mind to be silent, nor will we try to aggressively dismantle your desire for order and control. We are not here to judge the part of you that panics when a plan is left incomplete. Instead, we are going to learn how to change our relationship with that empty space, shifting away from vertical, muscular forcing and entering a wide, horizontal landscape of absolute receptivity. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight. Consider a surprising paradox that lies at the very center of your exhaustion. True completion does not arrive when you finally manage to manipulate every single variable of your life into a perfect shape. It manifests naturally when you stop interfering with the inherent timing of reality. We spend our entire lives operating under the illusion that there is a fragile, isolated controller inside us who must manually hold the world together through sheer force of will. But Buddhist wisdom reveals an entirely different truth. The ocean does not require a human plan to turn its tides, and the salt does not need your muscular labor to crystallize within the pan. When you step back from the frantic habit of forcing, you discover that reality is already functioning perfectly well, without your constant intervention. Maybe you have felt this too, the profound depletion of believing that you are the sole author of your safety, treating every open day or unread message as a dangerous gap that must be immediately optimized. We treat the natural stillness of life as an existential threat, exhausting our inner resources long before the future even arrives. In a moment, an original story from a quiet, salt-trimmed marshland will show us an entirely different way to inhabit the unstructured intervals of existence, a path that requires no manipulation and no striving. If it feels right, take a slow breath, letting the air widen across your chest, moving far out toward the edges of your body, entering the flat, silent landscape of your pure being. Imagine leaving the crowded, noisy structures of your daily obligations behind and stepping onto a low-lying coastal terrace where a flat, gray sea meets a wide, open sky. In this quiet environment, the ground is divided into a series of shallow clay pans, sitting perfectly horizontal, completely exposed to the elements and completely silent. There are no deadlines here, no incoming emergencies, and no expectations for you to fulfill. There is only the low, rhythmic murmur of the tide moving across the brackish flats and the immense expanse of a horizon that asks for absolutely nothing in return. You have arrived at a sanctuary where your labor is no longer necessary, stepping into a sensory world that allows you to trade the thin anxiety of control for the expansive, crystalline calm of an open shore. Across the low-lying coastal marshes where the land dissolved gradually into a flat gray sea, the air remained thick with the damp mineral scent of evaporation. Within this expanse of brackish channels lived an elderly salt farmer named Daisuke, a man whose skin was as deeply lined and weather-worn as the dry mud tracks surrounding his coastal home. Daisuke was a man of total silence, moving only when the low tide began its predictable retreat, his body completely attuned to the natural rhythms of the shoreline. To his remote coastal terrace came a high-ranking regional administrator named Kaito, a man whose chest was constantly locked in a tight, painful grip of suffocating urgency. Kaito was responsible for the vast distribution of the province's grain reserves, an immense logistical web that kept him awake night after night, his mind endlessly running through inventory tallies, delivery routes, and worst-case weather scenarios. He lived in absolute terror of an empty storehouse or a delayed convoy, treating every unstructured hour of his schedule as a dangerous gap that could lead to his ruin. He had traveled to this distant coast driven by a frantic belief that if he could learn a hidden discipline to perfectly master his time, his chest would finally stop aching. When Kaito arrived at the edge of the marshes, the early evening sun was sinking low, casting a long, pale golden glare across the wide clay terraces. He found the old salt farmer standing beside a series of empty, shallow evaporation pans, his wide palm resting on the handle of a long, smooth piece of gray driftwood that had been worn flat by the action of the sea. Kaito immediately began to talk in a hurried rush, his words spilling out like water from a broken dam, describing his endless responsibilities, his complex tracking systems, and the profound anxiety that gripped him whenever a single detail was left unaligned. The elder did not interrupt the frantic stream of words. Instead, he leaned down, picked up the long piece of driftwood rake, and placed its worn handle directly into Kaito's trembling hands. Dace pointed toward a small, shallow pan that had just been flooded with a thin layer of gray seawater, instructing the administrator to rake the surface of the pool. Kaito, eager to prove his diligence and find a quick solution to his pain, began to drag the wood through the water with rapid, aggressive strokes. He worked tirelessly, churning the water into a white, muddy froth, trying to push the liquid into a perfect shape, believing that his physical labor would accelerate the process. Yet, the harder he pushed and the faster he moved, the cloudier the water became, mixing with the dark clay beneath until the pool was a turbulent, dark slurry that showed no sign of clarity. The silent salt farmer stepped forward, placed his wide hand over Kaito's white-knuckled fingers, and gently halted the frantic motion of the wooden rake. Daisuke took the driftwood back, laid it flat upon the dry earth beside the terrace, and pointed down into the disturbed, muddy pan. He sat down on a low mound of salt-crusted clay and simply waited, his posture completely loose and receptive, looking out toward the vast, unmoving horizon of the sea. Kaito stood beside him, his pulse racing, his mind screaming that they were wasting valuable time doing absolutely nothing. As the minutes stretched out in the deepening quiet, the absence of human interference began to work its slow, natural magic upon the small pool. Without the agitation of the wooden rake, the heavy particles of dark mud gradually lost their momentum and began to settle, grain by grain, into the flat clay floor of the pan. The turbulent water grew increasingly still, its surface flattening out until it became a flawless crystalline mirror that perfectly reflected the immense open sky above. As the warm evening breeze moved over the stillness, thin, delicate sheets of pure white salt crystals began to form naturally at the edges of the water, entirely on their own, without a single motion from the old farmer's hands. Kaito stood perfectly still on the open terrace, the brackish wind blowing over his damp face as a sudden wave of deep emotional recognition washed through his core. He looked down at the crystalline flakes forming in the quiet pan and realized that his entire life had been a non-stop, exhausting attempt to rake the water. Believing that clarity could be forced through sheer muscular effort, he had treated every unresolved detail and every empty hour as a crisis that required his constant agitation, completely blind to the reality that his very effort to control was what kept his life in a state of turbulent chaos. He saw with absolute clarity that the salt did not need his panic to crystallize it, required only his willingness to step back. to drop the tool, and to trust the inherent timing of the shore. The twilight was deepening across the low-lying marshlands now, the pale golden glare of the sea turning into a vast expanse of cool deep slate gray. The sharp, mineral tang of the brine hung thick in the cool air, grounding Kaito's awareness in the immense stillness of the coastline, far away from his habitual calculations about the province's grain reserves. Take a slow, horizontal breath, letting your own chest expand outward toward that wide sky, letting your mind rest upon the flat, unmoving surface of the clay pan as it settles into the quiet of the night. This old story from the salt-rimmed marshland is not telling us to stop feeling, nor is it asking us to become cold, unfeeling, or detached from the genuine responsibilities of our lives. It is not an invitation to turn your heart into a barren landscape, or to pretend that the weight of an unresolved choice or an incomplete project does not cause a real ache in your chest. It is showing us something much quieter, a deep shift in internal posture that allows us to meet our obligations without needing to constantly agitate our own inner waters. When we look closely at our chronic state of overachieving anxiety, we begin to realize that our deepest exhaustion does not actually come from the tasks themselves. The true suffering, the tightness that locks up your throat and keeps your mind racing at night, was not only in what happened or what needs to be done, but in the exact way the mind holds the situation after the moment has passed. In our modern emotional life, what we often call attachment is that frantic, muscular gripping that assumes we can only be safe if we manually manage every single outcome around us. It is the silent internal voice that says, "Everything must happen according to my exact timeline, or I will face complete disaster." This constant craving for absolute control operates exactly like Kato's wooden rake, forcing us to meet every open hour or unstructured day with immediate aggressive agitation. When an unexpected delay occurs, or when we are simply confronted with a gap in our schedule, the body automatically tenses up, trying to force a resolution through sheer mental friction. We become like an administrator who spends all his energy churning the water, completely forgetting that the more frantically we push against the natural timing of reality, the cloudier our inner sky becomes. The ancient insights of Buddhist wisdom help us stop adding a second wound to the first. The first wound is simply the raw fact of life's inherent unpredictability, the delayed response, the unfinished project, the natural gaps and empty intervals that exist in any human journey. These are the tides that fill and empty our life naturally. They are beyond our immediate control, but they are localized and temporary. The second wound, however, is the one we inflict upon ourselves through our psychological reaction to the stillness. It is the secondary spiral of panic, where the mind takes an open hour and transforms it into an absolute proof that we are failing, that we are falling behind, or that our entire life is collapsing. This continuous churning of the mind against the quiet spaces is what truly depletes our inner resources, leaving the body trapped in a perpetual state of high alarm. When we practice true awareness, we are simply learning how to step back from this frantic administrative machinery and occupy a wide horizontal space of presence. This presence is the quiet, expansive quality of mind that notices your worried thoughts about tomorrow without choosing to become them. It is the capacity to feel the physical sensation of urgency in your chest and say, "There is a tight current here," rather than, "I must fix my whole life this very second." By translating this wisdom into our emotional reality, letting go ceases to mean giving up or becoming passive. Instead, letting go means releasing the extra, unnecessary struggle of trying to force the water to crystallize before its time. It is the willingness to let the pool be empty or cloudy for a moment, without allowing the agitation to shatter your core peace. Impermanence, when felt deeply within the body, becomes a source of immense comfort rather than a cause for anxiety. Every heavy obligation, every unresolved dilemma, and every difficult transition moves in its own natural cycle of evaporation and crystallization. They are passing tides, moving across your awareness like the brackish water, moving through the coastal channels. A delayed outcome or an empty day cannot permanently diminish your fundamental worth unless you grasp onto it, turning the empty space into a permanent deficit. Wisdom reminds us that the turbulence may feel intense, but the mud will naturally settle to the bottom if we simply stop dragging our thoughts through it. Compassion, in this light, is the gentle space that meets your own overthinking without turning it into a source of personal shame. It is the willingness to look at the frantic, micromanaging part of your mind and recognize that this exhausting pattern is not a moral failure. It is simply a tired, well-intentioned part of your biology that has been working overtime, believing that if it stops running for even an hour, you will be unsafe. By meeting this tension with a soft, non-judgmental presence, you allow the psychological heat to cool down, transforming the turbulent pool into a clear mirror. In a moment, this horizontal insight will shift from an idea you hear into a physical weight you can truly rest your entire chest into. The brackish air within our quiet marshland remains perfectly cool and still, totally unbothered by the heavy concepts we have just explored. The shallow clay pans at the edge of the sea continue to hold their ground, completely wide open to the wide sky, allowing the water to clear on its own. Take another slow, intentional breath, letting the active tension in your temples dissolve as we prepare to guide the mind into a much deeper state of physical presence. If it feels right, let your internal awareness flatten out, matching the wide, horizontal plane of the dark surface supporting you tonight. There is no need to create a forced, artificial quietness in your mind, nor is there any requirement to alter the natural, shallow rhythm of your breathing as it moves over your lips. Perhaps you can simply observe the cool, mineral crispness of the air entering your nostrils, unhurried and light, and leaving a quiet trace of warmth as it flows back out into the stillness of the room. With each exhalation, you might allow the front of your chest, your stomach, and the small muscles across your face to widen outward, imagining yourself softening into a broad, shallow clay pan left completely open to the night air. Let the heavy scaffolding of your daily schedule sink flat into the bedding, dropping your internal tools into the dirt. As you lie here in the dark, you might direct your attention away from the vertical, straining posture of the throat and the eyes, allowing your center of gravity to pull down into the base of your hips. For so many hours, your vital energy has been pulled upward and outward, tensing like a tight wire as you tried to manually manage the variables of your life and force outcomes through sheer velocity of thought. Right now, let that turbulent water settle, becoming cool, heavy, and brackish, spreading all the way to the edges of your physical frame. There is no need to practice this perfectly. Even noticing the faint, rhythmic movement of your rib cage is entirely enough. You do not have to perform this meditation to prove your worth to an invisible audience. There is no evaluation here, no penalty for unfinished work, and no standard you must achieve to be permitted to drop your effort. In this open space, you might notice one specific, cloudy thought or unresolved detail from your afternoon that is still trying to hold your mind in an active grip. Perhaps it is a sudden change in your plans that has left you feeling completely disorganized, an unread message that triggers a pattern of immediate panic, or a general sense that you must stay awake to mentally arrange the coming week. Do not try to aggressively push this thought out of your awareness, and do not dive into its details to solve it tonight. Instead, you might imagine taking that specific, turbulent worry and placing it directly into the center of one of those shallow, brackish clay pans sitting on the quiet coastline. Let the flat earth hold the entire weight of that unfinished situation for you. Watch what happens to that image when you stop dragging your mental rake through it to force an immediate clarity. You might notice that as you leave the worry resting on the quiet surface of your imagination, the heavy, dark mud of your overthinking naturally begins to lose its momentum. The clay pan does not resist the cloudiness. It does not panic over the unresolved shape of the water, and it does not try to accelerate the timing of the night. It simply remains wide open, holding the liquid perfectly still until the frantic loop of anxiety begins to settle, grain by grain, into the floor of your awareness. The need to protect your life through constant mental agitation begins to dissolve, replaced by the simple, horizontal reality of being a presence that is far too spacious to be ruined by a single unlined detail. If your mind drifts back into its old habits of tracking and inventory, or if a wave of physical restlessness surfaces around your collarbones, remember that you can return to the wide, flat sensation of your bones whenever you are ready. There is no need to force a catharsis or to promise your nervous system an immediate state of total, permanent healing tonight. True resilience does not happen by aggressively flattening your thoughts. It happens when you realize that your core presence is already expansive enough to let the water be cloudy without your interference. Let each slow breath feel like the natural, effortless evaporation of your daily obligations, allowing your physical self to become heavy, porous, and completely unresponsive to the urgent static of the mind. In a moment, our journey will take us back into the low-lying coastal marshlands, following Kaito as he returns to the silent salt farmer after many seasons have passed over the gray sea. The dry, brittle textures of the empty pans will begin to open a doorway into an even deeper, more radical form of inner permission. For now, simply allow yourself to remain right here, unmoving and horizontal, letting each breath sink you an inch deeper into the vast, crystalline safety of the night. Many seasons drifted across the flat sea before Kaito found his way back along the narrow dirt tracks that led to the coastal terraces. A severe, unseasonal drought had taken hold of the entire province, transforming the lush lowlands into a parched landscape of dust. And with this external crisis, a fierce new wave of anxiety had invaded the administrator's heart. The grain reserves were running precariously low, and his mind had returned to its old habit of frantic, exhausting calculation, working through the night to build a mental shield against the impending threat of a public shortage. He carried a heavy, burning knot of responsibility in his throat, a deep-seated belief that if he could not manually force a solution out of this barren season, he would be personally to blame for the suffering of thousands. When he stepped onto the low-lying terrace, the sensory environment was completely transformed from his previous visit. The coastal pools were entirely empty of seawater, their clay beds baked dry by the relentless sun, and cross-hatched with deep, brittle fractures. Daisuke was sitting quietly on a low mound of earth at the edge of the barren flats, his wide fingers resting on a small, unglazed clay tile that was heavily crusted with white brine crystals from a harvest long past. There was no water to clear, no tide entering the channels, and no active labor to perform. The entire foundry of the shore had ground to a complete standstill, leaving behind only the stark, silent architecture of the empty pans. Kaito sat down in the dry dust beside the elder, his muscles instantly tensing as he began to lay out his logistical panic, his voice cracking under the weight of the province's empty storehouses. He spoke of his desperate attempts to locate new supplies, his frustration with the stalled transport wagons, and the terrifying void of waiting for a rain that never came. The old salt farmer did not speak or offer a strategic solution. Instead, he picked up the small, brine-crusted clay tile and placed it directly onto Kaito's knee, gesturing for the administrator to look closely at its dry, cracked surface. Daisuke then reached into his woven belt and pulled forth a tiny wooden vial containing a few precious drops of fresh water, which he had carried from the inland well. He handed the vial to Kaito and motioned for him to pour a single drop onto the center of the dry tile. Kaito carefully tipped the wood, letting a solitary bead of moisture fall onto the parched clay. The moment the water touched the brittle surface, it was instantly swallowed up by the dry fissures, disappearing completely into the porous tile without leaving a trace of wetness on the top. Kaito looked up, his brow furrowed, expecting the master to explain how to preserve the moisture or prevent the dryness. The silent elder looked directly into Kaito's anxious eyes and moved his hand in a slow, wide sweep that encompassed the miles of empty, fractured pans stretching out toward the gray horizon. Daisuke closed his eyes and let his posture become entirely loose and heavy, leaning back against the sun-baked earth without a single muscle contraction. He communicated through his calm presence that when Kaito encountered an empty hour in his life, or a season of barren stagnation in his work, his spirit was acting exactly like a frantic man trying to flood a cracked tile with a single drop of water. The administrator was exhausting his vital energy, trying to force an immediate abundance out of a natural period of drought, treating the empty space as a terrifying deficit that had to be aggressively filled through sheer mental friction. The old farmer indicated that the dry, fractured pan was not a failure of the terrace. It was simply the natural baseline of the earth resting between the tides. The salt worker does not hate the drought or try to manufacture a false harvest from dry mud. He simply sits with the empty clay, allowing the pan to be exactly as it is, trusting that the dryness is just as necessary for the ultimate crystallization as the coming flood. True transformation does not mean reaching a state of magical perfection, where you never feel the sting of a crisis. It means discovering that your awareness is like the wide coastline itself, vast enough to hold both the full tide and the empty, cracked earth without losing its native, horizontal calm. Cato sat perfectly still in the dry, warm wind, the salt-crusted tile resting undisturbed on his knee. A sudden, quiet realization blossomed in the center of his chest, slowing the frantic, rapid pulse that had been hammering against his ribs for weeks. He looked at a rising wave of terrifying thoughts about the upcoming month's shortages. But instead of immediately reaching for his mental rake to manipulate the scenario, he did something entirely new. He took a slow, heavy breath of the mineral-laden air and simply allowed the uncertainty to exist within his awareness, without trying to touch it or correct its shape. He stopped the automatic habit of treating his fearful predictions as absolute truths that demanded his immediate exhaustion. He did not instantly banish his fear, but he chose a quiet act of discipline. He let his hands rest loose in his lap, leaving the small vial on the ground, and allowed himself to sit peacefully amidst the barren, unresolved interval of his life. In a moment, this capacity to sit with the empty spaces will help us dismantle the deep, hidden mechanisms that keep our own modern lives locked in a state of high alarm. The sun had completely slipped beneath the flat horizon of the sea now, leaving the low-lying marshes to be governed by a thick, cooling velvet of absolute shadow. The dry mineral scent of the parched clay and the ancient brine crystals remained perfectly suspended in the still night air, establishing a vast boundary around your resting body. Take a slow horizontal breath, letting the image of those quiet, empty terraces anchor your physical frame, letting the frantic urge to optimize the future dissolve into the deep, dark safety of the coast. When we observe the inner landscape of a mind that cannot find its way into sleep, we discover a complex administrative grid that runs entirely on the fuel of psychological resistance. We spend our evenings mentally sorting through past interactions, measuring our achievements against an invisible ledger, and trying to predict the exact layout of the coming month. This relentless habit of replaying old scenarios and rehearsing future choices is an evolutionary attempt to force a fluid, unpredictable world into a static posture of safety. The primitive centers of our biology treat an unstructured week or an unresolved dilemma as an immediate threat to survival, convincing us that the act of constant mental agitation is a form of necessary labor, completely unaware that this internal friction is what is actually draining our core vitality. A deeply exhausting aspect of this control dynamic is the unconscious tendency to turn our vulnerabilities into a permanent identity through a process of systemic self-judgment. When we encounter a period of professional stagnation, a stalled relationship, or a personal mistake, the mind immediately uses shame as a tool to try and force a transformation. We tell ourselves a rigid, repetitive story about our structural insufficiency, believing that if we can just condemn our current condition harshly enough, we can secure the validation and approval of the world. We begin to view our entire life as a fragile, broken vessel that must be continuously managed and aggressively corrected, rather than a wide, horizontal presence that is simply witnessing a temporary season of drought or emptiness. This is precisely where the ancient clarity of Buddhist psychology offers a profound emotional relief, separating our experience into what is recognized as the first pain and the second pain. The first pain is simply the raw fact of reality landing on our shore, the dry season, the delayed response, the sudden change in fortune, or the natural intervals of inactivity that exist in any human journey. These are the inevitable tides that move through our external environment. We cannot always control when the water recedes or when the clay beds of our life are left empty and cracked, just as the coastal terrace cannot prevent the hot sun from evaporating its moisture. This initial difficulty is a localized event. It is a passing season that naturally transforms if it is left unagitated by human hands. The true source of our chronic exhaustion, however, is the second pain, which is entirely manufactured by the mind's refusal to let the empty space exist without a struggle. The second pain is the massive web of catastrophic forecasting, historical regret, and self-blame we construct around a single unstructured hour or an incomplete plan. It is the voice that takes a brief plateau in our progress and turns it into an absolute guarantee that we are failing, that we are falling behind, or that we are destined to be left completely abandoned. We do not possess the power to stop the changing tides of life from occasionally leaving our pools empty, but we have the absolute capacity to stop dragging our mental tools through the dry mud. Every time we notice our thoughts spinning an elaborate theory about our unworthiness and choose to drop our attention back into our heavy, porous bones instead, we are starving the second pane of the fuel it requires to maintain its guard. True peace is never found by designing a life that is entirely devoid of dry seasons, empty gaps, or difficult transitions. It is found by establishing a fundamentally different relationship with that emptiness when it arrives. When you discover that your core awareness is not a fragile structure that must be aggressively filled with achievements, but a wide, horizontal coastline that can hold both the high tide and the dry, cracked earth without losing its expansive calm, the need to force outcomes completely disappears. You begin to realize that an unstructured interval is not a fatal flaw in your personal design. It is simply a natural baseline of rest passing through your awareness, no more threatening than a single brine crystal resting on an unglazed tile. You can allow the future to be completely unwritten without assuming that your safety is about to be ruined. By recognizing this psychological mechanism, your relationship with your own overthinking begins to shift from internal warfare to a quiet, compassionate observation. You can notice the frantic, micromanaging part of your mind without choosing to give it your obedience or your energy. This non-judgmental awareness does not need to violently eradicate the worry the moment you observe the urgency without treating it as an absolute truth. Its tight grip over your chest naturally begins to soften. You are no longer a turbulent, cloudy pool churning with every passing thought. You are the vast horizontal plane of the terrace floor, capable of holding both the water and the dry stillness, without losing your native, crystalline depth. In a moment, we will bring this open, receptive presence directly into the concrete settings of your modern daily life, exploring how to maintain this horizontal posture amidst the very triggers that usually disrupt your nightly rest. The dry, mineral air within your room remains perfectly balanced, completely unconcerned with the frantic calculations that occupied your day. Let your physical frame continue to surrender its remaining weight into this supportive darkness, allowing each rhythmic breath to remind you that your safety is already solid, spacious, and entirely complete right now. This horizontal, spacious stability is not an abstract ideal that you must preserve for a remote coastline or a silent meditation hall. True peace is practiced in the very small, unpolished moments that make up the gritty texture of your modern daily life. It is found in that exact second when you are waiting for a text message, watching the small screen glow against the darkness of your bedroom, and you feel that familiar, sharp contraction in your stomach because the reply is delayed. In that moment, the old habit of your nervous system is to repeatedly wake the device, checking for a superficial reassurance, treating the digital silence as an immediate emergency that requires a frantic mental solution. Wisdom begins when you notice that urgent impulse. Pause before touching the glass and realize that the delay does not decrease your own internal mass by a single ounce. We live in a culture that constantly demands we act like hyperactive administrators, forcing us to maintain a pleasant smile even when our interior landscape feels heavy, dry, and crusted with unshed tears. You might find yourself sitting through a long afternoon meeting, nodding automatically to look cooperative, while a relentless loop of self-criticism plays behind your eyes about a mistake you made last week. We look at a notification. We compare our quiet, unpolished, private struggles to the bright, edited trajectories of those around us, and we immediately decide that we are falling hopelessly behind in our life goals. The mind creates a false sense of absolute urgency, telling you that if you do not instantly solve your career, your finances, or your relationship dynamics by tomorrow morning, you will be completely ruined. But a profound shift occurs when you discover that not every frantic thought deserves your active obedience, and not every anxious feeling is a command that requires a reaction. When you feel a sudden surge of panic prompting you to double-check an interaction or fix a situation, you can choose to simply sit with the raw heat of the discomfort rather than running to manipulate the outcome. Taking a slow, heavy breath before responding to a difficult email or a challenging remark is a form of immense spiritual discipline. It is a way of demonstrating to your own nervous system that you are no longer a fragile barrier that shatters at every touch. You can care deeply about the individuals in your life without gripping their emotional states so tightly that you fracture your own core. You can support them from a place of solid density, like a massive clay pan holding its ground, rather than as a frantic sentry waiting to be knocked over by a passing wave. This also means that you are permitted to drop into an absolute rest tonight without needing to earn it through a day of flawless productivity. Many of us carry a heavy, silent guilt the moment our bodies try to soften, believing that if we are not actively producing, planning, or making ourselves useful to our environment, we are failing. But your fundamental value as a living presence is not a commercial product that fluctuates based on how much work you manage to finish today. You do not have to settle your entire destiny before you are allowed to close your eyes, nor do you need to apologize for seeking a sanctuary from the relentless noise of the world. Rest is not a luxury reserved for those who have achieved perfection. It is the natural, native right of a physical frame that belongs to the heavy bedrock of the earth. Let this horizontal, open mindset occupy your somatic awareness right now as you lie beneath the blankets. When the memory of a past mistake tries to pull your attention back up into the cold, friction-filled air of overthinking, let the sheer density of your bone structure serve as your anchor, pulling you straight down into the immediate dark. You can acknowledge that the difficult event occurred without allowing it to reshape your core character. By choosing to let the memory sit on your surface without feeding it with secondary arguments, you are gradually retraining your mind to understand that it is safe to step down from guard duty. In a moment, the final echoes of these practical applications will begin to cool down entirely, letting the teaching pass from language into pure, inert sleep. The space surrounding your bed is growing increasingly heavy, the dark air absorbing your presence without a single condition or judgment. You do not need to be a protective shield for anyone tonight. You are simply a wide piece of clay resting undisturbed in the deep, dark ash of the forge, completely hidden, completely non-reactive, and absolutely solid in your own quiet night. The active machinery of your thoughts is beginning to lose its sharp edge now, softening into the dark corners of the room like the quiet settling of dust on the parched clay flats after the wind has died down. The absolute necessity to organize, the habit of tracking these lessons, and the drive to analyze your personal progress can all be left behind on the floorboards tonight. Your physical frame is becoming intensely weighted, dropping into the horizontal support of the mattress with an immense absolute gravity that cannot be countered by a restless prediction. The wide muscles of your lower jaw are entirely relaxed. Your forehead is cool and smooth, and your eyes are blanketed by a dense, unreacting shade that has no desire to scan the dark for danger. Let the internal cadence of your pulse drop into a slow, rhythmic movement, syncing with the silent, expansive coastline that holds your rest. There is not a single problem left for you to manage tonight. The busy administrative offices of the daytime have been locked up from the inside. The frantic motion of the wooden rake has stopped, and the voices that demanded your attention have withdrawn into the shadows. You do not need to take your logistics, your inventory, or your defensive habits under the covers with you. Let yourself slip out of the heavy, rigid armor that you wore to navigate the friction of a demanding world. You are entering a wide, flat sanctuary where no tides are crashing, no outcomes are being weighed, and no one is calculating your value based on your visible output. The quiet atmosphere holds your skeleton with an absolute, unmoving security, treating your weariness as a natural, necessary return to the baseline of the earth. Let your awareness sink all the way down into the heavy bones of your hips, far beneath the high vertical planes where anxieties are continually rehearsed. Imagine your entire presence as an endless expanse of shallow, empty clay pans, sinking slowly into the cool, silent dark of the coastal night. The world may continue to move in its own erratic rhythm, and the unpredictable future may continue to vibrate on the surface. But down here on the terrace floor, there is only a spacious, crystalline silence. You are resting on a foundation that is far too wide to be moved by the passing echoes of an incomplete plan. With each slow, unhurried exhalation, you are shedding the evolutionary urge to fix the self through constant labor. Let the heavy darkness of the night wrap around your shoulders like a protective, cool layer of brackish air, dampening every residual signal, cradling your tired chest in a permanent stillness. You have permission to abandon the watchtower now. You have permission to let the coming weeks remain completely unwritten, to drop the unglazed tile into the dust, and to simply allow your consciousness to dissolve into the solid density of the shore. Gradually, the mind untethers itself from the necessity of control, sliding out into a deep, vast landscape of sleep where no variables need to be manually held together. The breathing has turned into a faint automatic whisper, a slow and horizontal tide moving through an interior world that has entirely forgotten the rhythm of urgency. You are safe here in the hidden dark, completely unreacting and profoundly whole in your own open space. When the tide recedes and leaves the clay beds completely bare, what if the emptiness you feared was never a sign of failure, but the very clarity required for the crystal to form? The heavy earth of that realization sinks deep into the core of your chest, anchoring you to the horizontal plane of the present moment with a mass that no passing thought can agitate. In the profound stillness of this midnight hour, the ancient truth of effortless presence reveals its most comforting secret. The shoreline does not survive the changing tides by pushing the water away, but by remaining wide open to whatever the sea brings to its floor. We spend our waking hours treating our peace of mind like a fragile structure that must be meticulously managed and aggressively defended, believing that any sudden delay or empty gap will ruin our security. But when you rest back into the raw weight of your own existence, you discover that the clear awareness witnessing your life is not a thin shield at all. It is the vast, indestructible terrace itself, which remains completely unaffected by the changing tempers of the seasons. Let this understanding soften the remaining layers of your posture, allowing the last traces of your physical guard to dissolve into the dense air of the room. When you look back at the friction of the day from this space of profound somatic density, you can see that the urge to brace yourself was never a failure of character. It was simply the natural reaction of a nervous system that temporarily forgot its own depth. You do not need to judge yourself for feeling anxious or for holding your body tight against an unresolved future. The deep clay beds do not anger at the drought that bakes their soil. They simply receive the dryness, absorb the heat, and remain entirely unmoving in their ancient, silent repose. Tonight you can be that clay, letting every future uncertainty and every past regret land on your surface without moving a single grain of your inner sanctuary. With each soft, heavy breath, let your focus descend even deeper into the unreacting weight of your skeleton. Feel the mattress rising to meet you, absorbing the residual vibration of every task, every message, and every digital notification from your muscles and your nerves. The modern world demands that we always stay alert, always stay visible, and always remain ready to justify our productivity to an invisible jury of peers. But the quiet darkness of this hour offers a completely different invitation, a sacred permission to be completely inert, completely unmapped, and completely anonymous. In this deep, cool sanctuary of your own consciousness, your daily obligations, your public reputation, and your worldly ambitions are nothing more than faint, cooling flakes of ash from a fire that has long since gone out. Think of the infinite relief that arrives when you realize that you no longer need to use your own anxiety as a tool to protect your life. The tools have all been laid flat, the wooden rakes are silent, and what remains is the pure, unconditioned space of your own presence, breathing quietly in the dark. You can care for the responsibilities of your life without becoming a prisoner to their shifting timelines. You can face the unknown tomorrow without requiring the future to be perfectly clear before you allow your heart to rest. You are whole not because you have solved every dilemma, but because your awareness is an expression of the very same solid mass that holds the ancient coastlines and the deep, dark floor of the earth steady through the night. The space around your bed is dense, cool, and protective, forming an absolute boundary between the demands of the daylight and the profound sanctuary of your rest. The thoughts of the afternoon have lost their momentum, turning into weightless specks of dark dust that are naturally carried away by the cool evening breeze. There is nothing left to defend, nothing left to rehearse, and no further calculations to make before the morning light returns to the salt terraces. You have returned to the very baseline of your own home, a place of native stability that requires no credentials, no effort, and no justification to inhabit. Let yourself sink completely into the deeper velvety currents of sleep now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and rhythmic tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is. This horizontal completion expands into the quiet spaces of the room like a deep shadow, settling over the vast expanse of the marshlands, absorbing the final remnants of the day's friction into its velvet dark. As you lie perfectly flat against the bedrock of your bed, let the understanding wash over you that true equanimity is not a wall you must build with your own hands, but the space that remains when you stop building walls altogether. We spend our waking hours treating our peace of mind as if it were a fragile property that could be stolen by an unexpected turn of events, or ruined by an empty gap in our schedules. But when you rest back into the raw weight of your own existence, you discover that the clear awareness witnessing your life cannot be touched, modified, or diminished by any external circumstance. It is an unyielding sanctuary that requires no maintenance, no active protection, and no validation from the outside world to remain absolutely solid. Consider how the shallow clay terrace at the edge of the dark sea does not shrink or change its nature when the temperature of the air around it shifts from summer heat to winter frost. It does not look for approval from the waves resting in the channels, nor does it hold on to the echo of the last rain that landed on its surface. It simply occupies its space with an absolute, majestic density, remaining perfectly content to be exactly what it is: wide, silent, and structurally unbreakable. You too can step into that profound, non-reactive way of being tonight. You can let go of the exhausting psychological demand to be an answer to every problem, a shield against every crisis, or a perfect manager of tomorrow's events. You can allow the future to unfold in its own unpredictable rhythm, recognizing that the deep presence within you is far too dense to be shattered by a passing breeze of circumstance. Let this release travel deep into your bone structure, dissolving the invisible armor that your muscles have held tight for so many hours. For a long time, the mind has operated under the false belief that to relax is to be vulnerable, that if you drop your guard for even a single evening, a sudden disaster will catch you unprepared and ruin your security. But as you sink deeper into this heavy state of relaxation, you can see that this hypervigilance is simply a tired habit of thought, a passing cloud of dust that has no power over the deep mountain of your true nature. You do not have to fight the anxious thoughts or use shame to force your mind into a forced silence. You can simply notice the worry as a small, harmless vibration on your surface, letting it hum itself to rest without choosing to give it your obedience or your energy. Think of how light your spirit becomes when you no longer carry the burden of constant self-assessment, when you can look at your own fatigue and see it not as a failure, but as a tender, natural reminder that it is time to return home to your own center. In this midnight environment, there are no expectations to satisfy, no achievements to display, and no critics waiting to evaluate the quality of your rest. You are entirely permitted to be hidden, to be unmapped, and to let your conscious thoughts dissolve like fine ash falling into a dark, quiet hearth. The wisdom of the empty pan has moved past the level of words now, settling into your chest and your limbs as a heavy, comforting mass that gently pulls you closer and closer to the absolute threshold of deep sleep. The darkness enveloping your frame is vast, cool, and protective, constructing a secure perimeter where your mind can finally stand down from guard duty. The events of the day, the messages left waiting, the small misunderstandings, the persistent worry that you are not doing enough, are all losing their sharp boundaries, turning into faint, weightless shadows that naturally vanish into the deep quiet of the night. You are no longer navigating the complex web of modern social survival. You are simply a silent, heavy presence resting securely on the solid floor of the universe, entirely safe, entirely unexamined, and profoundly whole in your own quiet dark. Let yourself slide completely into the deeper, velvety currents of rest now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and rhythmic tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is. This perfection does not require you to change a single facet of your current reality, nor does it demand that you first clear away the lingering clouds of today's unresolved dilemmas before you are permitted to sink into the deep. The modern mind is conditioned to believe that peace is a hard-won prize at the end of an endless line of corrections, an elusive state that can only be reached when every broken relationship is mended, every financial ledger is balanced, and every personal flaw is completely ironed out. We treat our internal tranquility like a delicate crop that must be aggressively forced to grow, oblivious to the fact that the very act of hunting for stillness creates the turbulent wake that keeps us tossed at sea. Buddhist wisdom gently turns this assumption on its side, showing us that the spacious, clear awareness you are seeking is not a destination you must laboriously build, but the very floor of your being that has been supporting you all along. Consider the immense landscape of the coastal terraces when the darkness settles completely over the salt-crusted channels, rendering the distinction between the land and the water entirely invisible. The clay beds do not strive to reflect the sky, nor do they panic when the rising mist obscures the horizon and hides the path back to the village. They simply remain broad, horizontal, and completely receptive, allowing the cool midnight moisture to collect on their surfaces without trying to measure its weight or predict its evaporation. The terrace is not trying to be an efficient machine. It is a space that allows things to happen within it, completely untethered from the human obsession with constant optimization. Tonight, you can trade the heavy, vertical exhaustion of the manager for the vast, unbothered stillness of the shore, letting your consciousness flatten out until there is no longer a hard line separating you from the quiet of the room. Let this expansive permission filter down through the deep, subconscious layers of your nervous system, untangling the small, hidden anchors of tension that still linger behind your chest and beneath your shoulder blades. For so long, your body has been trained to treat silence as a dangerous vacuum that must be immediately filled with plans, ideas, or self-corrections to maintain your safety in a competitive world. But as you sink deeper into this heavy state of physical relaxation, you can begin to see that this constant internal labor is the second pain, the unnecessary vibration we add to the natural stillness of the night. You do not have to fight the occasional, cloudy thoughts that drift across your awareness, nor do you need to use shame to force your mind into a state of artificial numbness. You can simply allow the worry to exist as a faint, harmless hum on your surface, trusting that it will naturally run out of momentum if you simply stop dragging your mental tools through its center. Think of how beautifully light your spirit becomes when you step out of the illusion that you are the sole author of your life's path, responsible for manually forcing every crystal of success to appear on your timeline. The old habit of checking for reassurance, of replaying an old conversation to see if you were perceived as enough, is completely meaningless in this vast midnight environment. There is no audience here to judge your progress, no ledger tracking your daily output, and no standard you must achieve to be worthy of this profound release. You are entirely permitted to be unmapped, to be unstructured, and to let your analytical mind dissolve like a grain of salt melting back into the warm, deep ocean. The teaching has moved past the level of intellectual concepts now, settling directly into your muscle and bone as a heavy, comforting gravity that gently draws you down toward the threshold of total rest. The darkness surrounding your resting frame remains perfectly still, a soft and protective sanctuary that asks for nothing but your complete willingness to drop your tools into the dirt. The events of the afternoon, the incomplete tasks, the minor anxieties, the persistent whisper that you are falling behind your peers are all losing their sharp boundaries, turning into weightless, gray shadows that naturally vanish into the immense quiet of the coastline. You are no longer navigating the complex web of modern social survival or trying to build a shield against tomorrow's uncertainties. You are simply a wide, porous presence resting securely on the flat floor of the universe, entirely safe, entirely unexamined, and profoundly complete in your own quiet night. Let yourself slide completely over the final edge of wakefulness now, trusting the horizontal mass of your body, trusting the spacious baseline of your mind, and letting your awareness fade into the vast, restorative ocean of an unjudged sleep. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and rhythmic tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense, dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is. This absolute perfection requires no effort to maintain, as it is the very baseline of your nature, existing quietly beneath the shifting tides of daily concern like the deep, unmoving earth that supports the shallow clay terraces. We spend so much of our lives believing that peace must be achieved through continuous action, that if we do not constantly manage our circumstances, we will remain vulnerable to every passing storm. Yet, when you look into the true nature of your awareness, you find a space that is already still, a wide and receptive horizon that does not fluctuate with the success or failure of your day's labor. This inner landscape is not something you need to build or protect. It is the vast, quiet ground that has always been here, waiting for you to simply step back from the rake and allow the mud to settle on its own. Let this deep truth spread through the physical boundaries of your body, softening the small areas of resistance that still cling to the memory of the day's urgency. When you look back at the frantic pace of the afternoon from this place of wide horizontal mass, you can see that the urge to control everything was merely a temporary wave passing over your surface. You do not need to judge yourself for the times your mind began to churn with worry, or for the moments your chest grew tight with the fear of falling behind. The coastline does not punish the water for being turbulent. During the high tide, it simply holds the space, allowing the waves to wash over its floor, knowing that the natural quiet of the shore will always return when the momentum has spent itself. Tonight, you can be that open shore, letting every unresolved plan and every anxious anticipation rest upon your surface without choosing to agitate their shape. With each slow, rhythmic movement of your chest, let your focus settle deeper into the heavy, porous reality of your physical frame. Feel the absolute stability of the surface beneath you, absorbing the residual static of your modern daily obligations, drawing the tension out of your face, your hands, and your breathing. The world outside will always demand that you remain in a vertical, defensive posture, ready to respond to every incoming request and maximize every available hour. But the vast darkness of the night offers a completely different sanctuary, a total permission to drop your administrative identity completely, to become unmapped, and to exist without any requirement to produce or perform. In this quiet, brackish environment of your own consciousness, your unfinished tasks, your social standing, and your future anxieties are nothing more than faint, dissolving crystals melting back into the immense sea. Think of the profound comfort that arrives when you realize that your fundamental worth is not a commercial ledger that must be balanced through a day of nonstop productivity. You do not have to earn the right to rest, nor do you need to apologize for letting the empty hours of the evening remain completely unstructured. You are permitted to let the coming weeks exist as an unwritten expanse, trusting that the solutions to your dilemmas will crystallize in their own natural time, without the need for your constant, exhausting intervention. The teaching has dissolved past the level of intellectual understanding now, settling directly into your bones as a heavy, soothing gravity that gently guides you closer and closer to the absolute edge of sleep. The darkness surrounding your resting frame remains perfectly balanced and still, a deep, protective velvet that asks for nothing but your complete willingness to let go of the tool. The echoes of the afternoon, the messages left waiting, the minor frustrations, the persistent worry that you are not doing enough are all losing their sharp boundaries, turning into weightless, gray shadows that naturally vanish into the immense calm of the coastline. You are no longer navigating the complex web of modern survival or trying to force a shape out of an unpredictable world. You are simply a wide, horizontal presence resting securely on the flat floor of the universe, entirely safe, entirely unexamined, and profoundly complete in your own quiet night. Let yourself slide completely into the deeper, velvety currents of rest now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and rhythmic tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense, dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is.